Well, let me thank you.
Okay.
This has been an enjoyable and I think important activity, kind of memorialized talking to the principals involved in the redevelopment. Looking back as, and in part looking back as a basis to looking forward and, what do we take from this? So we've shared with you, this is not going to be a question and answer, but I'd like to look at such things as why, who, what, outcome, hindsight, transferability. It's almost like what you would train journalists on: who, what, when, where, how. All right. But the most important thing we're finding is to start with the individual. Maybe you can tell us something about yourself and how you came to New Brunswick. I mean that, because we're finding that's important, that background. We can get maybe a little thumbnail sketch about where you were born, you grew up, went to school, your work, and then coming to New Brunswick.
Well, it's like everything's a big circle. It's where I was born. So I probably find most people in central New Jersey were born. I was born in St. Peter's Hospital. But more importantly, this was, when I was a kid, the center of the universe. I lived one block outside of New Brunswick, between Remsen and Livingston Avenue in North Brunswick. My parents both grew up here. Probably neither of them probably spoke English until they went to school, my mother being Hungarian and my father Italian. This was the center of the universe. You came here to go to church, you came to New Brunswick to buy your school shoes, you went to the doctor, if you were lucky, you got to eat at the lunch counter at Arnold Constable or at P.J. Young's. It's where you went and bought clothes. And this was the early mid-'60s. So it was obviously an important part. My father was a teacher in the high school in New Brunswick when I was a kid. So I would spend the last week of August sitting there stamping the books and uncrating the new social studies textbooks. And when he was coaching basketball, carrying the basketballs at the games and those kind of things. So it was an important part of my growing up experience. It was also the place by the late 60s where your parents told you, like, you're in New Brunswick, lock the doors when we would drive through. And it had changed that quickly. In fact, I'll never forget, and I don't remember if it was 68 or 69 when, I forgot what the polite term for what happened here was, unrest or civil disturbance.
Right.
My parents taking me down to Livingston Avenue because there was actually, believe it or not, in North Brunswick, a block from New Brunswick, there was a gun store in the back of someone's backyard. The guy sold hunting equipment.
Wow.
And we were designated one of those places that was more secured, so there were police at the end of our street for a week or two at night when there was this disturbances going on. So I vividly remember, the picture of Pat Sheen in the Home News. Home News was a real newspaper in those days.
Mm-hmm.
And standing on the hood on the front head of a car with a megaphone, talking to a crowd of people. My mother ran daycare programs for the YMCA here, and so people who I later came to know professionally and personally and created friendships with, like David Harris. David Harris was that young guy with the big afro in the Home News, which I remind him about all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the, we'd go to church on Christmas Eve and used to drive over to the neighborhood by New York Avenue, and the Lynches always had really nice decorations on their house. So these were people who I only knew as almost mythical figures in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
On one level, and the other side of it, like Bob Campbell was my Little League coach growing up. These people I knew when I was knew a totally different part of my life. So New Brunswick was never I didn't happen upon this as an adult and not understand the culture. Went to high school in North Brunswick and played football and basketball games against St. Peter's and New Brunswick, so this was kind of a part of my life. And then I went to Rutgers and lived here for 4 years. At that point, never thinking that I would return. I went to law school in Camden and lived in Camden, so that was a kind of an interesting urban experience, different than the one I had here. New Brunswick was never, my alma mater always having been kind of backhandedly supportive of the city in some ways. And I remember going to freshman orientation and being told you don't go underneath the bridge. by the public safety people at Rutgers. This was a place that I was always comfortable at. Never found it intimidating. I think even in the even in the late '80s, during that period of time, in the late '70s. I'm much older than I want to remember. Many New Jersey kids, particularly kids who were oriented towards New York City, or kind of come from some more of the kind of the exurbs, out of the Hudson and Essex County, kind of laughed when they thought that this was really a tough place. Because, and I guess in some respects it was, but New Brunswick always had a very interesting mix of population that I think never made it particularly frightening to any one group of people at any given time. So I left, went to live in Camden, got married, went to work in an awful place in North Jersey, Roseland.
Oh, really?
It's like the Oz of law firms. You had to get in your car. Probably the experience that has, not living in Camden, not growing up here, not the work that I did at the state, probably that 4 years I spent working on an old farm in a sea of office buildings probably impacted my view of urban life more than anything else. It took 25 minutes to get a tuna fish sandwich. You had to get in your car, you had to go drive into downtown Livingston, you had to wait in line, you had to come back, and it really shaped why an urban experience is an important experience for me. I ended up working for Governor Florio in the governor's office, and then I became the deputy director of the New Jersey Economic Development Authority, where I probably, by total happenstance, started doing this type of business. It's nothing I ever, sought out, woke up saying I wanted to be. Put it in a historical perspective, Devco was founded when I was 16. I remember Devco, New Brunswick Tomorrow process being a point of controversy when I was in school. I remember when.
To talk a little bit about that.
Just there was the issue of the man. John Lynch was the mayor, I guess, in those days. I worked. Not only did I when I lived here, but I worked on French Street growing up, like in high school. And I remember his first campaign, which was a Democratic primary, that him and George Hendricks, and it was very spirited. And then I remember, a little bit of the at least what I remember, the controversy or the stresses between the university community and New Brunswick, and much of it coming out of the planners at the university of what is good urban policy and urban renewal or removal and those types of issues. Not that I cared all that much. Wasn't part of my undergraduate experience, protesting anything, but I just remember it being an issue. I remember the city's inspection team coming in and getting ready to close a fraternity down for not having, probably which things I probably would agree that they did the right thing of life safety issues and things. But I'll never forget the building inspector wearing a sidearm and being somewhat offended by that. It's probably not until I started working at EDA that I became kind of more involved in these issues. And I really ran the real estate operation at the EDA that until the last 18 months was the worst real estate recession in American history in the, we're talking about 1991. Which was a great...
It prepared you for today.
Well, it was a great time to be 31, to be in the government, and being part of an area where you could actually do something important. We had money, we had resources. I worked with Tony Kosha, who's now the chairman of the Port Authority. He was 33 at the time. George Zoffinger was the chairman. He was the secretary, and we were able to actually, meaningfully provide some levels of financing for manufacturing real estate projects. And we did most of our work in those days. Spent most of my time in Jersey City. When this is the time when they were really trying to get Jersey City jump started. Got pulled back into.
What was that with Newport or?
Actually, it was the 101 Hudson, the Merrill Lynch product, the Colgate. Basically, worked on every time somebody would hiccup at the New York Stock Exchange, the Mercantile Exchange, any of those places, we would throw ourselves wholeheartedly into trying to get one of those exchanges to move their operation to the Colgate site. Worked with Bank of America, worked on a variety of projects. I think the leasing up of Newport Tower was probably the only real successes we had. Brown Brother Harriman, a couple cable companies, some other things. Worked on the Daily News printing facility, which actually the transaction didn't get closed until probably two most probably important events where I was collateral damage that had the most impact on my professional career was number one, and they were both Jim Florio being involved in both of them. Number one, he lost the 1981 election. It was a great thing for me personally. I was really involved in, I worked for Bill Hamilton, who had run for governor, then I got involved in the Florio administration. If he had won that election, I probably would have some awful job in DMV today and not be a, you know. But I went to law school instead. And then obviously the second time him being elected, and I'd be 49 years old and walking funny because carrying those really bad litigation bags to courthouses in Essex and Hudson County. I got to actually believe and do something fun. But then Jim Florio losing, three events probably. Jim Florio losing again probably got me at the right time out of state government and into something new. Christy Whitman was elected. The first thing I was told in the transitional period that I was supposed to go tell Mort Zuckerman that the deal was off and he couldn't move they weren't going to fund his move to Jersey City. So it was really kind of fun to be 31 years old and get sent to Mort Zuckerman's office while he smoked a Cohiba and blew smoke in my face while I told him we couldn't move here. The only good thing about the meeting was Barbara Streisand was there before I was, so I got to throw that her on the way out. But how I ended up here, is that interesting?
Yeah, that you can just take us there and then some of the early...
George Zoffinger had left Florio administration early. Was probably one of the smarter members of the cabinet. Got out early and took over the Kane Family Bank, the bank that was founded by the Kanes and the Roeblings, National State Bank of New Jersey. It was headquartered in Elizabeth. And George didn't like Elizabeth. He was living in Lawrenceville. His daughter was going to go to Rutgers. They had just done an acquisition in Brunswick Savings Bank, which is their landmark building is on Bayard Street. They're headquartered in this building. So George decided to move everybody out and move his offices here. Interesting how you find decisions are made in the corporate world. When I was working at EDA and we were trying to lure corporations from New York City to the Jersey City waterfront, the most significant part of that decision was where the decision maker lived. If he lived in New Jersey or if he lived in New York City, there was a decent possibility that you weren't automatically getting vetoed. If they lived in Westchester or they lived in Long Island, they weren't coming to New Jersey. So George decided to move the bank to New Brunswick because he liked it and it was closer to home. And I was already had packed up my boxes and was moving to New York to work for Windell's, Marks, Davies and Ives, which is Tony Kosha's law firm in New York. And George called me and said, he and I were working on the World Cup at the time. He was the chairman, I was the president of the World Cup host committee for New Jersey and New York. And he said, there's this thing called Devco. And I said, yeah, I know about Devco. He said, well, it's kind of screwed up. And Chris Folio left 18 months ago. There really hasn't been a president. Things have kind of slided away. And I talked to the guys at J&J, and they wanted me to come in as chairman. And I told them I'd only do it if you came and did this job. So he said, why don't you come? We'll do it for a year and see if we can fix it. And then you can go do what you want to do, but you don't want to be a lawyer anyway. And I said, okay. So I told my wife I was going to do it for a year, then I'd get a real job. And 13 years later, she's still waiting for me to get a real job. So we came here, and I think at the time when we took Devco over, there was...
And that's what year, just for
94. How many years ago?
15.
Oh. There was $110 in the bank, and we owed Johnson & Johnson something in the neighborhood of $10 million, and we had about $4 million of unsecured debt. That's what our balance sheet looked like. Today we actually have assets.
Is this post Hyatt? I'm just trying to...
This is 1990.
Yes.
Give you
Hyatt had been there for what, 10 years?
give you a historical reference to the Hyatt. The Hyatt opened 3 weeks or 4 weeks before my college graduation in 1982. So this is 14 years later. I finished college, went to law school, met my wife, had children in that interim period of time. All those things that we kind of landmarks in which we like look at life. Devco was really, they had gone through a point at that point where when Chris Folio left, there was and look, this was a very Johnson & Johnson driven organization in those days. It was actually and this is just my perspective looking back, kind of an interesting, and I'm not sure, I'd be curious to see what Chris' opinions of all of this were, because, in many ways, I think Chris kind of lusted after some of the support that I ended up getting that she didn't get here, because she was caught, and some, maybe Nero would also kind of agree with this, in kind of the pull and tug between Johnson & Johnson and City Hall. One of the things that they did well here, and when you talk about transferability, I've got some strong opinions about that because I've tried to help people transfer, both when I was at the state and since then, is City Hall did not try to, and John Lynch, did not say, I'm going to appoint X amount of members, J&J, you're going to appoint X amount of members, I want to be on the board. But what he very effectively did is, Chris, Nero, who probably played the greatest role in Devco's early days, had all worked for him.
Right.
But the money all came from Johnson & Johnson. So there was this interesting stress between the two at times over Devco. What I think John Lynch did amazingly well is, first of all, he recruited young people like no one ever else did. And it wasn't all about, you had to be from New Brunswick and go to St. Peter's and go to the right church. There was the Chris Folios and the Glenn Pattersons and these people who came to school here and wanted to be involved. That was probably, people can look at pretty buildings and stuff, but John Lynch built a personal infrastructure here that's second to none. That's why this city works and others don't. You can actually go to City Hall and get from one office to the other and get a permit to build a building. But at that point, Johnson & Johnson told George Zoffinger, look, we're no longer going to be, we want to participate, we're no longer going to lead, and this is, that was the quote, we're going to fund you for some on the operational side. I think J&J made a kind of long-term commitment to $200,000 a year, but we're no longer going to fund projects. And you're kind of on your own. Because after Chris left, they brought Leo Molino back in to do an evaluation, and we should find that study for you because it should be part of your archives.
Okay.
That said, Devco should stay. And the question was, I think John Heldridge asked, do we still need Devco? And if you need to, how would you reorganize it? And Leo did a report that said, it's kind of funny because you should read it and then see what our operation is today and see what he recommended. That doesn't necessarily jive. But he said, no, this is a good thing, you need to do this, you should reinvigorate it, because there had been this 18 months lapse. So there was this commitment by Johnson & Johnson is that we'll let you go hire a president, we'll give you some money, and let's see where you go from there. So, that's how in 1994 I show up. With this commitment, I'll do it for a year. And then we went off to try to figure out how we sort this out. I think what's important I'm just rambling, but
Right, no.
I think.
And I guess the sort out is that it's no longer going to be J&J with the checkbook.
Yeah.
They're there to help in some operations, but now the projects have to make sense, and you have to get financing
Correct.
from various sources.
And I think it's important to look to what Devco projects looked like prior to 1994 and what they look like after. I don't think anybody will have a coronary if they watch this and hear me say this, because it wasn't the story that I was told, but I've now, from my observations and having talked to people who were involved in the game in those days, I think people came to admit that's what really happened. I mean, look, Johnson & Johnson, one of the things I try to explain to the people in Newark when I've been involved there is, you have to wade into this business, and you have to wade in a big way, and it's a philanthropic adventure, and don't think you're going to make money on it. Prudential has gotten into litigation where they thought at Haynes and Griffith that they were going to make money. They would, and they weren't sure if it was a donation or if it was a gift. Johnson & Johnson never thought that they were going to make money on projects they invested in Devco. And they never called loans, they forgave loans, they did all of those things. But what they did do in some ways is that they protected a huge real estate investment. That property where, I remember it in 1963 after church on Somerset Street, going down and getting my first dog at the ASPCA down there. This was a really bad part of town in the 60s. Got protected by the Hyatt, by Kilmer Square, by this building and this building. And not that that's a bad thing. It was very good planning. Where other cities have tried to make constituencies happy and made investment in different parts of the city, what they understood here was critical mass right from day one. And, they created the critical mass at the corner of George and Albany Street, that intersection. They changed New Brunswick forever. But what those investments looked like from a Devco perspective in those days is Devco was a developer of the Hyatt. There was we're in the era of Jimmy Carter and the urban development action grants that New Brunswick has probably used wiser than any other city in New Jersey. I'll talk about that in a second. It was a loan. Prudential stepped in and helped finance the hotel with a room guarantee from J&J. Very quickly after it was up and running, Johnson & Johnson stepped in, paid back Prudential, paid the city back the UDAG, which is the critical thing. New Brunswick today still uses that money. I mean, it is 2010 almost, and New Brunswick is using money that Jimmy Carter gave to the city because they didn't give it away. The Urban Development Action Grant was really a loan program in New Brunswick, and they have recycled that money. And every once in a while, Glenn Patterson and I will laugh because I said, "What are you doing?" He's doing a little project up on Remsen Avenue. He goes, "Yeah, we got some UDAG in there." So, Kilmer Square. Kilmer Square was a project that was started by a private developer, went into bankruptcy. Devco, I'm not sure who, someone found Dyson Kitson Moran, who was interested in doing the project. Actually, Dyson Kitson Moran got involved. Devco built Plaza 1 and 2. J&J occupied them. They were then sold to Dyson Kitson Moran as part of some type of cabal. That money was taken and put into the cultural center, but I never quite understood that. We've tried to trace the paperwork. But again, on Kilmer Square, Devco became a joint venture partner with a private entity, but all of our capital was funded by Johnson & Johnson, and it was a loan to Devco. They wanted Kilmer Square done. They couldn't let Kilmer Square fall fallow. They didn't want to do it themselves. So they had Devco do it. Riverwatch, another perfect example. Started out planned by Devco. Again, going back to what, John Lynch really couldn't afford in the early days to spend a lot of money on staff in City Hall to do planning. Devco really played that early role of using, grant money to be able to do some of the early urban planning that got done in the city. Riverwatch failed under the first regime on the private sector, actually the Voorhees family.
were the
Yeah.
first owners.
Alan owned the property, a lot of the property down there.
All of it at one
Oh,
point.
all of it, okay.
They came in, restructured the loans. They brought in Adwin Realty from which is the Pico Electric company. When they all the utilities were involved in real estate in the 80s. Devco became a partner. J&J basically guaranteed the loan to Amboy National Bank that Devco held on the whole property. And as property would get taken down by the development team, the bank would get paid back, but J&J would pay the interest every year. So they were up until 1994, they were very hands-on. They were always had someone on the board who was also ran their real estate over there. They were involved in the partners meetings, and when I got here, a partner meeting at Kilmer Square and a partner meeting on Riverwatch would include J&J executives. Very, very hands-on in cleaning up. And I spent a good part of several years cleaning up the old Devco stuff.
Would you speculate that J&J had, in part, had to be in there so much financially?
Absolutely.
Because at that point, there wasn't private money. So
Absolutely.
That would be going.
If they weren't coming in and leveraging, allowing the private sector to leverage what they were doing, this never would have happened. And that's why, again, when I go back to the Newarks of the world and say, it's not about a couple $1 million of a donation and letting people, it was as important, quite honestly, the money as them rolling their sleeves up and being involved. They were smart people who had some good business sense and who had stature. And I think that probably was as important as the money, because this was becoming a worldwide company, and they were worried about the 16 condominiums on Ira Market, and they were worried about it because they had an investment. They were worried about it because their name was on it, but it was right there. It was
Right.
part of the plan. They were very big on the plan. What's changed there, and early on in the days, is that could be at a meeting in their corporate dining room and say something about Church Street, and them kind of look at me and have to take somebody to the window to show them. The people who were here in the early days at J&J, they were part of the community. They lived here. They worked here. This was not the multinational company that it is today. I mean, there's people in those executive offices know far more about Beijing than about New Brunswick, and understandably so. It's a different place. Also, the culture's changed from the standpoint was that the people who moved up in that company back in the day probably worked for the General, and they probably lived in this community, and they knew the streets, and they knew it's just generational change.
So we have the old model of Devco, and then you're coming in, and then if you can just take us.
Yeah, I mean, what we really try to find is how could we stand on our own 2 feet, and what we spent several years doing is taking this paradigm that they had, the creation of critical mass, and looking at the city, and we looked at 2 places that we could have the greatest impact, and that was one in the government district, and one, if you see what happened at the corner of George and Albany, why couldn't we? There had been some investment made in the Civic Square building by the Flory administration and by Rutgers. There had been investment made in the cultural center. There's no reason that wasn't the next place that we try to focus our attention. So we're looking at the government district, and we're looking at that area. We actually found a financing model that started a building in one and impacted another more greatly. The UMDNJ was looking for a administrative office. They could have gone into the Plaza building. They could have gone to Piscataway. Theoretically, they could have gone to Newark. I was having lunch with George Zoffinger and Ron Berman, who had just folded up DKM's operation in a couple of years, and he was back in the real estate business. And he was, George was actually interested. The meeting was because George was interested in investing in his hockey team in Trenton. And we quickly got into we're in Panicos, and we got in this conversation about this could be an interesting opportunity. There could be an interesting opportunity to do a project with UMDNJ. What do you think? And I said, I know exactly where we're going to do this. So he'd come back to my office. So he left the meeting the day before he was going to UMDNJ meeting with drawings that Michael Farewell had done for us on just a planning exercise at the corner of where Livingston George and Liberty, where the new UMDNJ building is. And we had done the analysis, the acquisition analysis, we had done the cost analysis, and we had some pretty pictures. You know, back when I worked at the EDA, I used to kind of scoff at people who had spent all this money on models and pretty pictures, because you know, by the time someone came to the EDA on a project in those days, they couldn't figure out how to do it, and they needed the last 10% pushed over the top, but they had worked on something for 7 years. I didn't really appreciate what an image can do. So he took those pictures, went to Newark, and we were off and running on a project, and we started using certificates of participation financing, which Berman had experience in doing the New Jersey Transit building in Newark. Certificates of participation are a unique mode of financing that the private sector can use to do public-private partnerships with the government, that it's really an installment sale. So UMDNJ agreed to a lease, and you took that lease to Wall Street and you financed it, and you operated the building, and they occupied the building for 30 years, and the government gets it for $1 at the end. They basically paid off the mortgage. So we did the project. I think we got paid $100,000.
And I guess, so Wall Street is now replacing J&J with the financing.
Correct.
Under the stream of lease payments for 30 years is the backing on it.
Correct.
So,
And what we were trying to do was to try to find, what we immediately tried to do was say, look, all of our projects should support the whole critical mass theory. All of our projects should be multi-use because we only have limited resources, so you don't ever going to build an office building anymore. It's going to have parking, it's going to have retail, we're going to have change streetscape, we're going to do those things. I mean, Liberty Plaza, in some ways, I say this about every project we're doing, it's probably the most significant project we've done to date. We pushed the building back, we established a new design concept for streetscape, we got outdoor dining. You know, we also started to show that if you build quality retail space, you can get good tenants. We've had GNC, we've had Radio Shack, we've had Dunkin' Donuts, we had Soho, outdoor dining. But we've always kind of endeavored that our project should meet some broader public policy goal.
and actually, if I can go back on the multi-use is being envisioned as both good business sense, and that you now have someone paying a higher rent on the, for retail because it's retail, and if you have retail, it's a more interesting building. So
building's bigger too. I've always found if you make stuff bigger, it becomes more financially viable. So if you add 50,000 square feet of retail, or 25,000 square feet of retail, 100,000 square foot retail, you're spreading the sunk costs over a larger, and everybody benefits from that.
As well as, I would think, from the planning benefits.
Correct.
You want a city is all about multiple uses.
Yeah,
and
you're putting office on the first floor in the middle center of the downtown is a travesty.
It's part of, so you don't have to drive 25 minutes for your tuna sandwich.
Exactly.
Because you just go downstairs.
And you make a more pleasant place to live, to work. It was all about making a more pleasant place to
Did
work.
Michael Farewell design that then?
No,
Oh.
somebody else designed it.
All right, so we're using this more innovative financing, and we also, this model of mixed use, which is both a financing and a planning benefit.
So we spent a couple of years totally redoing and revitalizing the government district.
Mm-hmm.
County was thinking of renovating the old, ugly county administration building. 14 floors, 10,000 square foot floor plates, not a men and women's bathroom on every floor, just an atrocity. And someone thought it was a really good idea to, it was those days we had plenum ceilings where you blew hot or cold air into the space between the drop ceiling and the concrete slab, and through the holes in the tile, the fresh air dropped. But people forgot that the asbestos that had got blown on the steel was going to fall and block that. So what happened is the employees would knock the tiles out to get warmth or cool air, and the asbestos would fall on. So we came in and said, look, maybe you don't want to renovate this building, but we've designed a building on the former jail site next door that the county owns. And what we want to do is long-term lease that site from you. So we'll make a cash payment to the county, which is always a good thing to say to the government. And we will build a building. We'll replace your 140,000 square foot building with a 115,000 square foot building. That will be state-of-the-art, will be energy efficient, and that we had done an analysis of what it cost to operate the old building. They were operating at $14 a foot, and we'll operate this for you at $6 a foot. So we will cut more than half of your operating costs, and you'll have less space, and you'll have more usable space. We had the same amount of usable space in a building that was 30,000 square feet smaller, by just from design issues. At the same time, New Brunswick was looking for a new police station, and the mayor agreed to take the old post office site, move the New Brunswick Police Department there, move the Middlesex County Prosecutor's Office, the municipal court, and the postal workers, everybody who has guns, into one place. So this was pre-9/11. The concept was if we separate the courthouse and the administration building and the police, that some buildings could become more accessible, which is the truth, which has happened even post-9/11. Because you used to have to go through the old administration building to get to the courthouse, and you had different populations that were mixing. You know, if someone was coming to get a passport, they didn't necessarily have to be with the people who were going to the murder trial, or the children that were going to there because their parents were being divorced. Or this population was being mixed up. And so we took the 135,000 square foot building we were building on the post office site in the county administration building. Now we're getting one construction contract for almost 300,000 square feet as opposed to building 200,000 square foot buildings. But more importantly, the county, who had the best credit rating out of all